Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Nelson, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 72nd Annual A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts, featuring Dr. Stephen D. Houston, Dupre Family Professor of Social Science at Brown University. He also holds affiliations with the Departments of Anthropology and the Department of History of Art and Architecture. Before arriving at Brown in 2004, Houston served as Jesse Knight University Professor at Brigham Young University. Houston is a renowned scholar of the ancient Americas, focusing on the art, architecture, and writing systems of the Maya. In this extraordinary world, his research engages notion of the body in antiquity, Mayan urbanism, as well as epigraphy and decipherment. Looking at the natural world, spending as much time as possible in the field, and employing scientific and digital technology, Houston has helped us understand the complex world of the Maya and has enabled us to know better the lives of some of those who lived during that time. For example, in his article, The Good Prince, Transition, Texting, and Moral Narrative in the Murals of Bonaparte, Chiapas, Mexico, Houston explores the late 18th century hieroglyphs associated with the Bonaparte murals in Chiapas, showing how the typology, positioning, relative weighting, and onomastic contents of the captions clarify a veridical story, artfully positioned and cadenced in the murals that stresses a tale of three youths. His analysis revealed to us a network of relations, morals, and positioning focused on a prince of the court. Houston has produced numerous books and articles, most recently, Temple of the Night Sun, a royal Maya tomb at El Diabo, Guatemala. His work, The Life Within, Classic Maya and the Matter of Permanence, won the Prose Award for Art History and Criticism in 2015. He also co-curated Fiery Pool, The Maya and the Mythic Sea, an exposition exploring ecological aesthetics in Maya civilization. Houston has been honored with a MacArthur Fellowship, he's a genius, as well as fellowships and grants from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the National Science Foundation, Dumbarton Oaks, the Clark Art Institute, and the National Endowment for the Humanity, amongst many others. In 2014-2015, he served as the center's Elsa Mellon Bruce Senior Fellow. From 2018 to 2019, he served as the inaugural Kislak Chair at the Library of Congress, supporting interdisciplinary in-depth research projects. In recognition of Houston's scholarship, the president of Guatemala awarded him the Grand Cross of the Order of the Quetzal, the country's highest honor. Over the next 6 weeks, Houston will take us through the world of Maya writing or glyphs of ancient Mexico and Central America, introducing us to a realm of text and image that in ways allow us to better understand the intersections of language and visual experience. Since 1949, the A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts have presented the best in contemporary thought and scholarship, and this year is no exception. The program is named for Andrew W. Mellon, founder of the National Gallery of Art, who gave his collection to the nation and for funds to build the West Building, which opened to the public in 1941. On behalf of the National Gallery, I would like to thank Stephen Houston for his care and generosity in preparing these lectures and with working with our staff, whom I would like to thank for putting this all together. It is such a privilege to have you here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Houston to the lectern.
And I should say, all who know me can affirm that I'm no genius, but I am someone who works very hard and very diligently. And above all, I'm appreciative of all of the friends and good colleagues I've had over the years. And they include, of course, Stephen, but also Elizabeth Cropper, who first invited me to give these lectures, 3 years ago. And then we've had such a gracious and warm welcome from the staff here, as Stephen pointed out as well. It's wonderful to be back home, and I'm delighted to be giving these lectures. It's an extraordinary honor. I'm going to start quite a ways from here in all sorts of understandings of that term. I'm going to be going to the West Coast and introducing you to this young man who died almost exactly 30 years ago. He was struck by a passenger train not too far from the Budweiser plant in the Southern California region around Los Angeles, while stepping back to admire some mural graffiti painting that he had done as part of a collective called Can't Be Stopped, Nor Could They. He was renowned among his fellow muralists, or as some would call them in their own argot, bombers or taggers, for his generosity and for his ability to operate both through individual acts of expression, but also as someone who worked with others. And his passing led eventually to the creation of a series of commemorative murals, which can be seen today, if they're still extant, I have to say. These are from photographs of that look back to his life, to the life of Aaron Anderson, to the life of someone that that is called by others Skate. And here you could just make out in a kind of lava lamp lurid coloration one of these murals, and perhaps you can also make out his name there in partly legible writing. There's also this mural, which reproduces the photograph I just showed you, and it's replicated quite a bit in a number of these murals. Some of it is really quite distinct from what we saw before. It has this lurid, almost, again, dark tone to it, a corpse-like. There are flowers or roses that suggest or hint at something of a funeral. And there is up above the statement in partly legible writing, if flamboyant, rest in power, RIP. And then there is also there playing out across the surface, Skate, his nickname. The most elaborate of these murals, however, takes me to the core of a set of questions that, believe it or not, also pertain to the ancient Maya. This is a mural created by Posh One. I actually don't know his name. I gather it's bad form for muralists to identify themselves, but this image was provided by my good colleague, the brilliant sociologist Stefano Bloch. And Posh One is someone who has created a mural that is so elaborate that it is somewhat difficult to read. It also occurs in what I would describe as a contested space. And you can well imagine from looking at graffiti in a city like DC that there are lots of responses potentially to these kinds of expressions of this kind of creative work. In LA, there might be a group of appreciative fellow taggers or bombers or muralists who would look at this and be able to evaluate it aesthetically. There might also be irate civic leaders who are very upset at the production of these kind of murals in places that are not directly authorized. And then in a more sinister vein, and there is the altogether more distinct group of groups of criminal gangs who might view these murals as impingements on spaces that they wish to control. So context is important, but also the recipients, the people that would be looking at this. One of the points I can make here is also to introduce a term that comes from the medievalist Armando Petrucci, now passed away along with, of course, Skate. And Petrucci is someone who introduced a word that I find of some utility here, and it is the graphosphere. This is the sum of all visible marks and words, which hopefully can be appreciated by anybody, but also more to the core of what I'm looking at today. They can be interpreted analytically from an academic vantage point. Petrucci was mostly interested in the civic graphs or marks that would occur in early modern Europe and also perhaps in the late medieval period. For instance, in this image, you can just make out graphs or marks left by celebrating students who have passed their exams at the University of Salamanca, and they still sit there, these graphic exuberances. But graphosphere as a term, as Petrucci understood it, and as it has been elaborated by other scholars, is one of a near supple and infinite flexibility. It depends entirely on what kinds of questions you want to ask. You could look at a graphosphere that might simply consist of ephemera, handbills, let's say, or it might correspond to ethnic groups or nations or even further beyond, or diasporic communities as well. It depends on what you want to look at analytically. They're also indisputably matters of control. I would call them gradients of control. Now, it is the fervent wish of any autocrat anywhere in the world to exercise complete and absolute control over the grassosphere. They want only their own communications to be authorized and made public and to be disseminated. But the fact of the matter is that this is almost impossible to do. There is nonetheless a wish in many hierarchical societies to exercise as much control as might be humanly possible. And this is something that is very much part and parcel of the Maya experience of many centuries ago, as we'll look at it here. But looking back at Posh 1's mural, what can we also say here? Well, it's not just, is it, about language. It has a lot of other visual information, almost a surfeit, a glut of information. It's rather difficult to read even. Complexity, in fact, seems to be the point. And a fellow tagger or bomber muralist, not Posh 1 and not Skate himself, said a piece being a mural, should be wild style and complicated, a secret language and code that should not be deciphered too easily. You have to be in the know. You have to work hard. You have to, in some ways, invest some sweat equity in order to interpret this. And so if we go to the next image, you'll see through the magic and legerdemain of PowerPoint that I've made this text a little clearer. It says skate. And I just a minute before added those little tines on the E, being an anal compulsive person, I'm sorry to say. But it is important, I think, above all, to understand that something fascinating is going on here cognitively. And I would call this the toggle, in which we go back and forth, or the brain does, in such a way that you see it as an image, you see it as a text. There are different parts of the brain that are being implicated in this processing. Now, this is not a lecture series about cognitive processing. That would take yet another Mellon lecture, perhaps one to come. But what we can do is look at that core proposition here, which is that writing is not just about sound. It has many, many other layers of meaning. It has many other compactions, flamboyances. It has, if you will, a high degree of saturation. Now, since I am the Mellon lecture, it sounds so pompous, doesn't it? I can also make up words, and I'm going to make up one right now, which is hypergraph. How does that sound? Now, and these are marks that are not simply about one narrow bandwidth of communication, but they're layers and again, compactions of meaning and sound and yet more meaning. If we look at this image left for us by Posh 1 in commemoration of Skate, we can also perhaps here see 3 vignettes that I want to draw your attention to right now. So I placed them on the side of the image. And then I've also done a little bit of sleuthing for you, because that would be very kindly of me, and been able to tell you right now with a high degree of certainty, that these are extracted, these little vignettes, from a central Mexican book called the Codex Figuration Maya that is now found in, of all places, Liverpool. So they didn't just produce the Beatles, they also have an extraordinary collection of artifacts. Now, why did Posh 1 invoke these? Well, one explanation might be this is part of a larger discourse about the ethnic affiliations of LA with areas to the south. Okay, we can set that to the side. We can also ask, is Posh 1 somehow appealing to the cosmic solemnities of all of the intricate details of this Mexican book, in which it's relating space and time, and something that not even Einstein would have thought of in terms of this degree of semantic complexity? They're sacred sites, they're mythic birds. Or, as many people have observed, that page from the Figuration Maya is probably the most reproduced image from all of pre-Columbian America, at least to judge from what we can see on Google. And in fact, just to make things perfectly clear, what Posh 1 has done is written for you in legible text. He wants to make this absolutely clear. And he's describing this as the trees of life and the God of the dead, a deliberate juxtaposition. And then below, RIP Skate 1. He's referring to this gentleman I was introducing you to before. And another part of the image, the mural that I've not shown you, he also signs his name very legibly. So there are limits to the kind of visual or graphic obfuscation that takes place here. And so what I want to do now is to address all of these themes together by folding us back collectively into a look at the ancient Maya. And here I have a set of words which you now understand. I'm a patient professor, and hopefully you can understand what I mean by wild stylings, by hypergraphs, and also by the Maya graphosphere. We're going to enter into the rich semantic and visual choreography of this world over the next 6 weeks. Now, it would be mischievous and indeed really rather unkind of me not to give you a little bit of an introduction. This isn't Florence. This isn't some area in Paris or perhaps London that would be familiar to many of you, or perhaps even China. It is an area that is, to some extent, relatively close by in terms of travel, but also very, very, very distant in terms of the people that live there. And the area in question is, of course, the Yucatan Peninsula, which I've highlighted for you here in red. And you'll also notice I've done a little trick here in which I've underlined or underscored the plurality of the places, of the times, and of the peoples. For this is another tension that plays out in this kind of scholarship, which is, do we assume that everyone within this region was the same, or do we assume with equal, I think, degree of confidence that they were all somewhat different in their local manifestations? There's a kind of shared idiom, if you will, graphically and even linguistically, but there are also many, many forms of variety that we need to be paying attention to. This part of the world is also frequently understood as a green hell in popular understanding. And to be honest, it can be one. I've spent untold hours of my life in this kind of setting with acquiring all sorts of strange diseases, which I don't need to go into here. But there is a kind of caricature about the tropics in which it is inundated with these monsoonal rains. It's highly unpleasant. It's highly inimical to human existence. And nothing could be further from the truth. For this area is one that's replete with very, very large populations. It's also an area that is undergoing dramatic change. Now, as the pet project of the current president of Mexico, a large train system is actually being driven through the heartland of the Maya. And you can see here the kind of ecological devastation that's being wrought as a consequence. But there being uncovered are also archaeological ruins that tell us a lot about cities such as Tikal, where I have also worked, at least as an advisor. Tikal is now covered with that jungle that I was just showing you. But in point of fact, there are now, thanks to the magic of LiDAR, a kind of technology that I don't really have time to describe, we can produce this kind of image, which comes to us care of colleagues at Tulane. That is precisely the same site, but now stripped of vegetation. There are indeed no lost cities anymore in the Maya world, provided that we can introduce this technology. I've also, I hope, helpfully provided an arrow here linking that pyramid you see poking out of the jungle over to the side with that same structure, that same edifice as exposed by this LiDAR. And then down below is the Royal Palace of Tikal. There are other sorts of precisions of vision that are now possible. Another one is temporal. That is, we can understand chronology and time of how actions were sequenced in a way that was simply not possible before. These are some of the periods that are familiar to us in scholarship, from the pre-classic, about the time of Christ and before, into the classic, the famous collapse that many of you doubtless have heard about, and then to the post-classic, and eventually to the time of the Spanish conquest. The period that interests me most, however, is the classic period. Why? It's because it is the most, in some ways, eloquent or articulate in terms of its writing. It tells us a lot about itself, and we're able to understand it in part because of decipherments. And this is work that I've been engaged in the last 30 years, but there are many, many colleagues involved. This is a new form of visibility in which we can visit the Maya in their own words and their own conceptualizations of what they thought was important. And this is done by means of decipherments that take us to this document in particular, which was produced first in the 1560s, and then later iterations were made under the auspices of a Franciscan bishop, a friar named Diego de Landa, who's thought generally to be a kind of odious guy, but he left us this extraordinary document, and in it, our Rosetta Stone. It is a kind of calibration or commensuration between Maya glyphs, which Stephen was alluding to before, and then Latin letters. Now, the bishop was hopelessly confused about this. He didn't understand that this was no alphabet, or this was, in fact, a set of syllables. But from this, and from work done by brilliant colleagues like Dave Stewart, Simon Martin, Mark Zender, Dmitry Bayayev, and there are many, many others, we're able now to read these texts in all of their linguistic subtlety, generally speaking. We have word signs, we have syllables, we have nuances of rhetoric that give us a sense of being able to listen to these voices and to pay close heed to them in a kind of respectful way. Now, another point about the hieroglyphs is that they did have a word for these signs. It's a kind of semiotic jargon that the Maya themselves employed. And this was deciphered by my good buddy, Dave Stewart, many years ago. They called the glyphs woh. And woh might mean letter. It's employed in very, very few Mayan languages, as far as we can tell. It's highly localized in description, but I want to emphasize 2 points about it. The first is that it seems to have been always understood not as floating in the ether, as a set of understandings in the mind, but as something material that would be brought and raised up. As you can see it here on this monument, the glyphs are directly adjacent to woh, which I've illustrated for you in this slide. This is a wall panel from the site of Shkalamkin, and the glyphs are entirely legible. And the figure is also looking out at you in a way that I'll return to in just a couple of minutes. One of the other fascinating things that I've noticed, this is the second point I wanted to make, is that on one text far, far in the south of Guatemala, they seem to refer to these signs, the woh, but they also specify that they appear to be related to an area to the north. And I suspect that was always seen as a writing system that was in itself intrinsically localized as being understood to have a homeland, not in the periphery of the Maya world in that map we were looking at before, but there smack dab in the middle. From this linguistic understanding, other understandings have entered into our consciousness. One of which is that this is a profoundly unequal society that use conditions of, and you'll forgive the jargon, I hope, diglossia, of high and low languages. Think of medieval Latin, or perhaps the French that would be spoken at the English court at the time of Chaucer. And then the language that would be spoken out in the fields or in the farms. These would be places where non-elites presumably would have gathered. But imagine the consequences socially of this disjunction in which we would have a kind of banter going on at court, at royal courts, that would simply not be understood by anyone else. There is an exclusivity here. Now, the images also are in a way a rather coquettish. And if you think about it, and looking at this limestone panel from Bonampak in Mexico, there are identifiable, recognizable elements. There are people seated down below. They're holding up, maybe you could make out, a throne or diadem that is being passed to a lord on a throne. And in fact, this is referencing his accession, his enthronement to high office. You can recognize that, but I defy any of you without prior training to be able to read those hieroglyphs. To think of this as a pulling in with the images, which include, and then a deliberate exclusion as you draw close. You are being told that you are not invited to this particular party. Now, the final point I wanted to say by way of background is that these royal courts are all important in creating or concocting these text and image combinations that we'll be exploring over the next couple of weeks. And they were presided over by a figure called a kohulahau, which is a figure that we can now describe as a sacred or divine lord, not necessarily godly, but godlike. He's not seen as a god, but as someone in close communication, potentially, with figures in the celestial realm. There is a near total invisibility of lower levels of society. Now, let's ask another question, because you've heard this word glyph, introduced by Stephen. There's also this word hieroglyph, which of course all of you know. And we have to pose a broader question of what is the nature of a glyph or a hieroglyph? Because these are linked phenomena. And it helps to frame the discussion that's going to come. We can ask ourselves, why are certain writing systems ones that engage long-term in this pictorial commitment and don't leave it behind? Many writing systems depart from it, but these don't. What does it say about picture? What does it say about words? Now, this is from the tomb of Tutankhamen, and I've underlined his name for you there, just it's basically unpronounceable. No one quite knows what the vowels were. But this is a great example of hieroglyphs, and in many ways, one that can be understood with respect to three different things. I'm going to sound a little bit like a medieval philosopher here, but I would reduce this understanding to three essential points. One feature would be the thingness. This would be a hieroglyph or sign that has edges and interiors, that has mass, that has heft, that has material properties. Another dimension here is whatness, which are features held in common that distinguish them from other things. That is, we can know that the chick there or the sign for n might also repeat elsewhere. This allows us to get to the third dimension, which is thisness. And this is a key point about many hieroglyphic systems, which is that they're unique, that they're often handmade, they're bespoke, the way a fine Savile suit might be in London. They are always going to be loudly proclaiming their individuality. Now let's look at my example of this. And believe me, we're not going to have too many comparative examples. I'm now taking you to the graffiti worlds of LA and to Egypt, but this is really a lecture about the ancient Maya. This is a Maya example, which has been studied by my good friend Simon Martin, who is here with us today. And I've given you here a technical transcription of the glyphs. And then in the next image, I'm giving you those same glyphs as rendered into Maya, which means, you'll have to take my word for it, Lady Child Jaguar, the Lady of Tub, which is a site we haven't quite nailed down, but it would have been an important dynasty in northern Guatemala in the first millennium AD. If I isolate that one glyph in particular, which is a mewling jaguar baby, it's on its back and it doesn't look very happy. Nappies need to be changed. Who knows what's going on here? But it is nonetheless the embodiment, the exemplification of an infant baby jaguar. What does it have? Well, it has whatness. It has thisness because it's painted here. And it also has thingness above all. And so that thingness, I'm not sure what that means, whether we should exit or not, but hopefully the sound will stop soon. It implies that there might be a capacity for action here, that there's an innate vigor that possibly would be embodied within this sign. It's there. The baby jaguar is, in a sense, almost emoting to you, and it is also emitting some noise. This brings me to that commitment I mentioned before. This is an image of a deer that you see in the top of this image. The Maya, as with other hieroglyphic systems, made a sustained covenant with the future in which they would make and maintain the thingness of that object and that sign over time. And so we might look at that deer as it is occurring in hieroglyphs in about 300 BC. And it's a particular species of deer called a brocket deer. It's an adorable little creature. And then you can see this is a sign that actually shows a final version of a deer glyph, and it's a hand being held up. It's probably a kind of hunter's gestural language to reproduce the antlers. Now, one of the points I want to make right at the outset is, again, contemplating that matter of whatness, is the Maya never embark on a pathway of cursives or of schematic signs. They always retain this over time. Now, another introductory point I wanted to make before we begin to examine vitality and setting up the rest of these lectures is the matter of representing writing. And Meyer Shapiro, the great art historian, studied this, of course, some decades ago. This is a document that shows us Ezra. He's writing in a book. And Shapiro and other scholars have long asked themselves, why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because what it allows us to do is to get to the bottom of what contemporaries thought writing consisted of formally and contextually. And it just so happens this is also a topic among the ancient Maya. These are two monkey scribes of all things. They're patrons of that particular class, that particular occupation. They've got a Maya book that's open slightly. And I will now observe two things about this image, which strike me as exceedingly interesting and odd. First of all, you can never, in these images of books, read anything legible in them. That knowledge is being withheld from you. The other is that Human beings are, to my understanding and to my knowledge, never shown with these sacred books. They're not part of our world, apparently. They're an extra human knowledge. Now, when writing is being shown in Maya writing, sometimes with possibly historical figures, it is always what I would describe as unwhole. You cannot read it. It is withdrawing from your understanding potentially important information. Here is an atole bowl. It's a kind of liquid drink made out of masa or maize dough that's mixed into water. And there are incised glyphs that were incised into this post-fire, or excuse me, after the painting was done. But they're not supplying you with information as to who that bowl belonged to or who might have been related to this act of drinking. This unwhole property of writing also extends to the Bonaparte murals that Stephen mentioned before that I've been engaged in studying over the years, particularly with the cooperation and supervision at times of Mary Miller of the Getty Research Institute. And there at the midsection of these three figures, I've highlighted for you areas that in fact contain hieroglyphs. And if we get up close to the infrared images that I took of these with the engineer Gene Ware and then subsequently processed by Yale University, we can see legible hieroglyphs. And what they're saying are, it's painting, and then the next image over to the right, his clothes, but they never specify who those clothes belong to. There's a kind of, again, coquettish, coy quality to what they're describing here. But above all, we can almost see the presence of a kind of taboo in which certain information is not meant to be recorded in these images of writing. And this brings me finally to pseudo writing, which is a fascinating topic. And these are the visual essence of glyphs. They are often placeholders for actual writing and occur mostly at the peak times of literacy during the classic period of the Maya. What do they show us? Well, they show us that the Maya are focused on the rounded outlines of glyphs, the compound blocks, thinner lines that contrast with fuller ones, and then ordering into rows and columns. They are mimicking, almost parasitizing writing, but they are not. At the same time, this sort of repetitive writing is important because it gets to the bottom of what the Maya, at least aesthetically, might think was going on with this writing. Now, at the urging of my colleague Shantine Morrill-Hart, I thought, well, let's get AI into this business. And so I typed in a bunch of instructions to create glyphs. And there is an eerie resemblance between pseudo writing that the Maya might have produced and then this kind of gobbledygook that you see on AI images that are purely in some computer mind somewhere. And the fascinating point for art historians of here, of course, is that eventually if this technology develops as it surely would, you'll be able to get or to acquire a kind of algorithmic precision to these elastic and elusive concepts like style. And this is something we definitely need to be paying attention to. But ultimately, let me also make another point, which is just because they're pseudoglyphs, it doesn't mean they're meaningless. And there are many examples of asemic, of non-meaningful writing, including this example from Said Twombly. There's a more recent example from Tauba Auerbach, which shows doodles from a little pen that she had in childhood, in which there is contextual meaning. There are other assertions being made in terms of what the artist was trying to get across. And so there is intent in a way, there's context, most certainly. Now, getting back to this combination of picture and text, of how they're being brought together, they can seem like unitary productions, but I will tell you now, they're not really. Because in my point of view, my way of thinking, it's better to address this whole problem, which we'll be looking at over the next couple of weeks, in terms of a division of labor. And just as the National Gallery is run by guards we cannot do without, we have important intellectual figures like Stephen and Elizabeth Cropper. Everyone works together, but they have different tasks. This has been a concern for many years by some of the few theorists of comics. And I think I'll try to make the point seriously that how we look at comics is how we perhaps also need to look at hieroglyphic writing in terms of these text-picture combinations. Now, these theorists include Scott McCloud, who's read by everybody in their foundation art programs anywhere in the country, but also Will Eisner, who has this oozing, dripping image, which is supposed to show the suffusion of smelly things and unpleasant odors across New York. Now, McLeod and Eisner, in talking about this relationship with comics, are, I think, um, uh, focused on high art versus low art distinctions, and that they all belong together somehow. It's not a very interesting question. And obviously, it is about storytelling, and this is leading to the Lucas a Museum of Narrative Art, which you probably heard about. But what's also going on here is that Eisner and others, such as the scholar Matthew Peterson, believe we can look at this in terms of prose or writing that's subsumed, prose that is made prominent, chiefly prominent, and then ultimately, if I can get back here, to full integrations of the two. Now, this is an example of subsumed writing. There's no writing on this vessel. And then yet, if you look at it, it actually consists of these series of registers of small figures and very animated conversation. And they're almost laid out in phrasings, as though there's some simulation here of the rhetoric that you would see in writing. And in fact, the text itself, if we can call it that, the set of images, begins with an open book. It begins with the head of a scribe, and over to the side is another scribe who's dipping his hand into an inkwell. Yet the way in which this would be accessed visually is very similar to how you would read a Maya text. Now, this is an example right here of a rollout, of a ceramic cylinder vase that was studied by my good colleague, Christoph Helmke. And it's being read in columns and from left to right. And if we examine and go back to the pot we just looked at in rollout form, seems to be obeying exactly the same kind of strictures of how this is accessed. It's being read across and it's being read from top to bottom. So that would be an example in which there is a kind of conversation still taking place here. Now let's get to an example of prose primary, in which it seems only to be writing. And we're going back to that pot that was studied by Christoph Helmke, shown here in rollout form as drawn by Professor Helmke. Now, they're only glyphs. And so is there another visual component to this? And I would say resoundingly yes, because the size of the glyphs, the way they're disposed around the surface of this vase, corresponds to different categories of information. There is non-linguistic information that's being conveyed here. There's an introductory time. There's a moment in between, highlighted for you in red, in which there are dynastic tumults that are taking place here on the border between Belize and Guatemala. And then it ends in very, very large glyphs with the illustrious parentage of the person who was responsible for all of these activities. And then there is always, even in purportedly purely textual contexts, the press of the pictorial. There's a lot of alliteration for you, in which we have glyphs that show the action of walking, Agni, he runs, walks, shown for reasons that are still very unclear as a small dwarf body. And then to the side for the expression ilokoi, then he leaves, is a snake that is issuing rather alarmingly from a little fissure in the ground. Now, in terms of the final sort of integration of the two, there is this pod showing a deer. He's bipedal, which is highly unusual, and he's holding an enema syringe, which is equally unusual. And there are often opaque motivations as to what the Maya are up to in some of these more integrated images. This is a deer, and it says by it, gee, deer. Well, of course it's a deer. And yet, at the same time, they're probably emphasizing that they can simply use hieroglyphs, which is a rare skill at that time. But beyond that, what they're probably beginning to show us is this is not like any other deer. You might be confused by its bipedal stance. And so we need to specify what kind of critter it is. And then the final point I want to make before we get to the final winding section of this talk, this introductory talk in the Mellon Lectures, are imponderables that, of course, by definition, we can't talk about. If we look at the vase of the 31 gods here, which I had illustrated before, we have to imagine that people who looked at that, unlike us, know what it's saying. They understand and can recognize some of these personages. There is a rich, almost encyclopedia of off-screen information that is accessible to them. And we also have to believe, as we do when we look at the Bayeux Tapestry in Normandy or other kinds of productions of that sort, in these highly orally oriented societies, that there would have been a kind of oratory taking place. There would have been a performance as well. There are other individuals off-screen who are engaged actively. Now, the final part of this introductory talk, and believe me, I hope I'm launching this successfully for the next couple of lectures by providing you with a shared background, is what does it mean to represent? Is it a mere semblance, as in this instance of an ancestor at the small city of La Amelia in Guatemala? Or is there a bold and audacious proposition of shared essence between this carving in limestone and that of the being it represents? Now, this is a bas relief, again, in limestone. It's pitted, it's eroded in detail, but there's enough for us to identify this individual, and he's holding in his hand a almost celestial fire that seems to be associated with insignia of office. It's almost as though I was able to hold Zeus-like lightning itself within my hand and yet somehow escape burning. The first kind of vitality I'll talk about is what I would describe as representational vitality. And this is a vitality that comes from showing living, writhing, breathing, and moving things. These are two examples that were drawn by David Stewart, again, excavated by Marcello Canuto at Tulane University. Now, the blue arrow has, I hope, helpfully spelled out for you that that is a dog running in front of the throne. I've never, ever seen this before. And so it definitely excited comment when it was first spotted. How do we know it's a dog? It's because of its snarling dentition. It seems to have an alert tail that's wafting upwards. It also has often a kind of frayed ear that comes from various parasitic or tropical diseases that afflict dogs in this area and at times archaeologists. And there are many things here that are a little difficult to make out because of the erosion. There seems to be a woman kneeling behind the throne. The dog is running actively toward it. What the heck is going on here? I wish I could tell you, but there's definitely a larger story. This is a vitality that comes from you, presumably as a Maya viewer, someone who has seen a dog, you've heard a dog, you've even smelled a dog, I hope not, but it is a creature that abounds in Maya cities today and communities today and would have in the past as well. Another kind of vitality would be body vitality that begins to affect the depiction of certain signs. Now, these are all syllables. These are glyphs that are reading ubaki, spelling out ubak, meaning his bone, literally inscribed on a bone, drawn here by Dave Stewart. Now, the middle syllable usually occurs in another way, but here, notice what's happened. They've equipped it with a human profile, and I hope that you can make out a little hair bun up on top, a bit of a coiffure, their eyes, their noses, there's a nose, of course, their lips. This is a human profile that affects not one whit, not a bit, the reading of that sign, and yet there it is. This body vitality also occurs uniquely in an example drawn to my attention by David Stewart of glyphs that have animal profiles. And this is from a pot that's in a collection in Guatemala City. And what it shows are profiles now of some sort of rodent. And the reason for this, probably in this kind of graphic contagion that tends to spread memically across other hieroglyphs, is the fact that there are two rodent glyphs actually within this particular text. It's as if the scribe were inventively inspired to elaborate it in this way. Now, the ultimate version of this kind of figuration are the full figure glyphs, which are extremely difficult to read. This is an example that's carved and was on actually display here at the National Gallery many years ago, and is drawn by Simon Martin. And here, there is, again, a kind of off-screen existence in which these glyphs that have partial faces have bodies, too, that are sometimes inserted into these textual compositions. And to give you an example, let's contrast here the ubak we were looking at before. Remember that head? And down below is a similar kind of sign, not precisely with the same value, but that's not important here. But you can make out the nose, I hope, and the eyes. And now,
Sprouting down below is a seated body, chastely dressed, I might add, in a little loincloth. This is not someone who's going naked. There is similarly here, as with the hypergraphs of Posh One's mural, a toggling that takes place. And what does it do? This toggling from sign to picture to sign and back again, as you look at this, as you try to access its meaning and its sound, there is inevitably the compulsion to begin a slow reading process, not the rapid handwriting and the rapid kind of shorthand that is popular in certain traditions around the world. Now, these full figure glyphs are extraordinarily elaborate. They're being produced only, in my estimation, for a period of 2 to 3 generations. I suspect many of these people knew each other, and that was also something they would have learned perhaps in one place. Some of these full figure glyphs are decorous. They're behaving properly. They're not embarrassing anybody socially. They're courtly. They're attentive. They're composed. And in this instance, they're seated, as you might expect, on a throne that happens to come from the city of Copan. Now, what about the indecorous glyphs? Those naughty glyphs that will not behave, they also can be figured with bodies here, but with faces. And I've highlighted for you in gray. And now they're bestial. They're vocalizing. They're doing all sorts of things which are appropriate to the animals. And what are those animals? There's a snake, there's a toad, and there's a feline. And each one of them is presumably hissing or maybe eating, as we've seen boas and other snakes eating or gorging on or disgorging prey. There's croaking that would also take place, and then there's roaring. And there's even a suggestion of a kind of nocturnal aspect to what's going on here. The glyphs are there, almost active at night, and they're making a great noisy racket to those who understand the conventions of their depiction. Call, in fact, Maya writing the noisy writing, because synesthetically, it is also always, I think, invoking this concept of sound that's coming out of the words and then being channeled through their depiction. Here with these little multiple red arrows, I'm showing you all of the kinds of orientations of the glyphs with gaping mouths. And even the central figure in the image has a head that's thrown backwards. And that is because he is also probably singing and calling out. He is orating. And so the question then becomes here, is this merely representational, or does it again perhaps offer that savor of an innate fatality? Now, second, there are 3 examples of this, is interactive vitality. And here, let's turn to a different part of the world. This is a Mughal, late Mughal, post-Mughal painting from northern India. And it shows a bunch of monkeys and also bears who are involved in a great battle of Rama. And suddenly there's contact because one of the monkeys is looking out at you. And this would be the breaking of the fourth wall that is known to Shakespeare, that is known to Thornton Wilder, that is known to, yes, Martin Scorsese and Goodfellas with Ray Liotta's performance. The monkey has looked out at you and he has made that kind of contact. Now, to emphasize how peculiar this will be among the Maya evidence that I want to describe to you, is it's not at all the norm. And in fact, most Maya writing is snubbing you. It's highly indifferent to any sort of direct visual engagement with the people in front of it. If we look at these hieroglyphs from a stela beautifully drawn by Alex Tocqueville, the hieroglyphs are always resolutely and internally within the frame of that image text, looking to the side. They're not looking out at you. They don't seem to care about you one whit. Now, all of this appears to change quite radically with the introduction, the impact still hotly debated about an incursion from a distant city in central Mexico that's called Teotihuacan, not too far from present-day Mexico City. The first images of full frontal depiction of breaking the fourth wall occur in monuments that are related to these foreigners. And here you see one such foreigner to the side, or one at least being patronized by such foreigners. And in his very tomb are pots that also show that full frontal depiction of a human or deity face looking out at you. There's an uncanniness to this, an anomaly of the uncanny foreigner who is not obeying the rules as we would understand them. And it is a legacy visually that continues in the Maya evidence, so that even later references to these kind of Teotihuacan figures in Maya imagery tend to show them staring out at you. It's one of their badges of being so different. But it's not just foreigners. Birds do this too, and not any kind of bird, but the uncanny, unblinking, stereoscopically equipped owl. And when those glyphs occur in writing or in imagery, that owl breaks the fourth wall. It's looking out to make direct contact with you. This is the ikunkui. And they even go to the trouble of defining the difference between birds that look at you, portentous birds, and ones that look to the side as this possibly this raven. These owls are renowned today in the Maya region with its rich ethnographic legacy as birds that communicate fell and dire things. And then there are tricksters. It's almost like an in joke in which a rabbit, it's kind of like a Brer Rabbit, in fact, if you're familiar with the Southern tradition. It is the rabbit that looks out at you, almost winking in some ways in this highly enigmatic scene. Now, I am a professor at Brown University, so I have to give a little bit of a trigger warning here, as I do with my undergraduates. These are some disturbing images coming up because famously the Maya were not necessarily observing the Geneva Conventions, I'm not sure how to put it, during the first millennium AD. And here are some captives. There's a deceased one to the side. His head is all that's left with torrents of blood coming out. Notice that one of the captives is looking out at you. He is breaking the fourth wall. What is going on here? What is the artist attempting to elicit from you as the viewer? Is it pity? Is it contempt? Is it schadenfreude? Is it unease, foreboding? Or is it even, as we'll explore in the final lecture of this series, a disquieting kind of humor that we would struggle to understand today? This is an eviscerated, emiscerated captive looking out at you, breaking the fourth wall. And there's even this glyph, which may possibly be that of a withered, dried skin of a trophy head, in a textual setting, looking at you, and breaking the fourth wall. Now, the final point I wanted to make here before I am trundling to a conclusion is there are a few statues around the Maya world, usually on the far margins of the classic civilization, in which we have fully rounded column sculptures. These occur at Copan. They occur at the city of Tonina. Respectively, Tonina is over in the western part of the Maya world, very close to other non-Mayan languages, and that is also true for Copan, which is in the southeastern portion. These are ones in which you can engage that figure as though you were breaking the fourth wall. Now, what is being said here? Are they allowing direct interactions here, a kind of breaking of the fourth wall with flesh and blood figures who might wish to walk around these majestic carvings? Or is it rather on the part of the patrons who commission these an aggressive, almost perpetual occupation of civic spaces by ruling lords during, but also after their lifetimes, heedless of those around them? So breaking the fourth wall is anomalous. It's about foreigners, it's about sacrifice, it's about tricksters, and it's about marginals on the frontiers. It's about borderlands. Now, the final point I wanted to make is really the most audacious claim. And it's one that would be familiar to many of you working in non-Western traditions, looking at art styles elsewhere. And this is the deepest, or what we might call the strongest claim of all, which is there a shared essence? Is there shared energy and a shared identity between the thing that is depicted or the being that is depicted and then the carving itself? And here they're almost making mockery of the way we distinguish in Western theology between immanence of spirits that occupy matter and of transcendence, of spirit forces that flit around beyond and outside of our world. It's all being brought together here in a seamless whole. There are mobilities that are possibly being instantiated here. Now, why do we think that the Maya of the past might have thought this way? It's because it occurs among the modern, many millions of living Maya who have been studied by ethnographers over the years and who are themselves participating in their own self-accounts, as should be the case. And here we have a legacy that is really quite fascinating, again, touching on foreign things that are full of energies. And they include, believe it or not, sewing machines, scissors, and evangelical music, which is thought to be highly disturbing, apparently, among those who have studied this. And in each one of these, including the rocky outcrop or cave, they're things from outside, or they have to do with these foci of energy in areas at the margins of human settlement. Now, we've known for 20 years, and I'll just give away the game here, that the Maya did understand that hard, polished, hard-won materials were ones that were imbued with innate vitality. How do we know this? It's because things such as stele, things such as polished jade, or even glyphs that refer to both of them, have within them the face of a god looking out at you. And you can imagine how unsettling that would be to look into a mirror, to look into the polished surface of a jade adze, and to see a face looking out at you that's not quite like yours, but a little bit different. And this deity has, from the conventions we understand, acute eyesight. It's able to look out at you. These give us some reasonable evidence that objects were imbued with life. At core, this is an animistic idea, and I don't mean this in any kind of derogatory way. The best explanation that I've read, and there are many for animism, is simply that it's a world full of persons. Imagine this podium as a person. Imagine the door that you pass through as a person. Imagine this mic as one. But some of them only, to Maya understandings, past and present, are human, and others are not. And so life is also lived in relationship to these other kinds of presences. And this indeed appears to be spelled out in the Maya data. When the Maya describe an image, what they do, this is something that David Stewart and I have worked out in a variety of contexts, is they will use a particular sign. This is a figure of a ruler at the city of Naranjo who is governing about 1300 years ago. And there, right by his name glyphs up in his forehead, just to make it crystal clear who might be at the central focus of this stela, is a glyph that we can read as Uba, which means it is his head. This is how we identify one another, not by toes or by hands, but by our heads. It is itself, and above all, it can be understood in these contextual settings as the body image. Now think of the implications here. What it means is that one can have replicable or distributed personhood or identities that passes from this flesh and blood body that I have, which will surely not be here for many, many, many decades to come, into a representation that has indurated me, that has made me permanent, that has made me hard rock-like almost, something that will not be worn down by the elements. This does not be true with any material. It would only be true with a few objects. The way in which this plays out as we come to a conclusion here is that there are pieces of evidence that tell us that there can be another kind of process in which the same body is actually occupied by different concurrent spirits. A good example is this amazing pot, which was photographed years ago by Nicholas Helmuth. It's in the images in the collection of Dumbarton Oaks. And there is a figure dressed as a toad. He's playing his maracas, his rattles. He's a noisy individual, as we saw from the full figure or partially figured glyphs before. And as Mike Coe, my mentor at Yale, pointed out many decades ago, he is shown here in X-ray vision, just to make it highly explicit as to what's going on. There is a lord's face indicated here by a yellow arrow with his carefully filed teeth, probably done when he entered into manhood. And then highlighted for you in red is a toad who's croaking away, and both of their mouths are open. What we have here is something that Stewart and I have called impersonation, God impersonation, but it's so much more than a kind of shallow performance. It's the occupation in one body of spirits that are human and then spirits that are charged with sacred energy. And this is another stele in which this is probably going on. There's a figure who is impersonating the sun god, and from his nostrils comes a hot flare of solar fire, and from his head comes another shooting beam, as if as we've been able to understand these conventions. And so there's an endless multiplication going on here, a mobility of spirits that go in and out of matter. And this is a vitality that takes us to a set of paradoxes to conclude my talk, which is of things that are true all at once. We have this obsession with finding things that are or are not. What if all of these were going on simultaneously as a set of ancient paradoxes that help us to understand this material? For instance, we can ask, as I've posed this afternoon, this is a standalone carving. but it is also part of a graphosphere. It's part of a kind of discourse, you might say, or conversation with other monuments nearby. We can also say that it's an autonomous monument. It stands on its own. It was commissioned by a particular king, but it also involves perhaps those off-screen aspects of human behavior and practice, which take us into the realm of performance. And then ultimately that matter of representation, which vexes us as we look at traditions around the world. Does this representation participate in being? Is it suffused with self, with identity, and with existence? And ultimately, as I conclude here, I think the lessons go far deeper, because what they do is they take us into broader claims about existence, going from something that we would presume to be inert or static to something that is instead pulsing with spirit and with these dense hypergraphs that are saturated with so much meaning. And what they're doing is, I think, ratifying a number of earnest truths that also tell us more broadly about the Maya, and as we'll see over the next couple of lectures, in that they coexist with humans, but also these participations in spirit of the multiple bodies in which the human identity is expressed, in which it is fused with the spirit world, are what ultimately make us human and accentuate some of those properties. And so I end with an invitation that please come back and come and listen to me hold forth at length about topics that have fascinated me for many decades and have enlivened my life, and hopefully will instruct yours over the next few days. Thank you very much.